Okay, and then next definition. So if we were in my title, I've said most talented performers. Similar kind of question. Not an easy one. How are you interpreting the word talented in that kind of context? So when you're going to be talking about your talented performers in the answer to my question, what's your reference point?
A very sport-specific ability, if that makes sense. So they just, relative to others around them, they just have a greater ability to execute skills in their sport more consistently and at a higher level. Just have a much, I guess, a better outcome more regularly. Okay. So certainly consistency, there's a relentless about it, but it's also about their ability to execute that to a high ability.
Okay.
So I guess the two words around that are certainly precision and accuracy to execute sport-specific skills.
Okay.
And that may be, when I talk about sport-specific skills, it's not about being physically strong or anything. It's your ability to execute. I don't know, if you're Jofra Archer and you want to put in a bouncer, the ability to do that same bouncer at that same pace in the same time, all the time.
Yeah, of course. Okay, and then my final definition is, again, my title references unfamiliar and challenging environment, and I gave you my context, which is winning away from home, usually in the subcontinent or the southern hemisphere. I guess, in your mind, if I say unfamiliar and challenging environments, what are you thinking of, particularly with your Team Sky context?
Yeah, so every year when a Tour de France gets announced, it's different. The parcours and the course is different. And you may not have been there, you may not know how to race it. There's an uncertainty, if I call it a greater uncertainty, going into that environment than one you may be familiar with. And the uncertainty just comes from, just your exposure, if I call it that, to that environment.
Yeah. Okay, very helpful. Okay, I'm going to get into some of the more specific questions now, I guess.
Yeah.
So, if I start with a greater focus on sort of identification and selection, so if we're talking about preparing talent, if we start off with, well, how does that talent get there? If you can have in your own mind either a Tour de France sort of year, or even something that was typical in each year, or whatever might be relevant to you, how much attention to detail has gone into the recruitment of those individuals and those athletes based on where you're going to be? So again, forgive my ignorance, but I'm assuming you find out where the Tour de France is before you then go into recruiting, and therefore how do those two things add up?
No, it's slightly different. So you certainly don't know what the parcours is, but within a professional cycling team, you'll have 30 riders, and they'll all have specific roles. So it's a bit like in cricket, you have fast bowlers, spinners, batsmen, wicketkeepers. There are some specific roles that individuals will play. So there's like a prerequisite where you get selected. So you may be domestique, you may be a super domestique, you may be a time trialer, you may be a GC, would be an all-rounder, but they'd be really good at all of them. So you have a bank of riders in your team that you have who have the right characteristics to be the best in their role. The parcours then gets released. So in October this year, the Tour de France route was announced. And what that gives you a particular feel of the type of riders you're going to need. Of course, you'll always know you'll have a GC rider, but you may have one particular GC rider where it's stronger. So if there are 3 time trials in the Tour de France this year, you'll know Chris Froome's going to be better than Egan Bernal, for example. So all have a prerequisite, which the course that you're going on. That does help define who best fits. It's then about preparing for that event specifically. So in the Tour de France this year, they would know that the last 3 days were high mountains, and so high mountains is really high altitude. And on paper, the guy who won at Egan Bernal was always possibly going to be the best. He wouldn't have been the number one choice at the start of the year. But Froome crashed, Geraint crashed and was off form. And the way it sort of played itself out has meant that on paper at the start, he was always the one with the greatest potential because of that aspect of the course. Okay. So you have a group of riders that have got generic skills. A bit like in a cricket team, you'll have fast bowlers, you'll have spinners, you'll have that. You know where you're going to, and you understand the course a bit more. That helps break that group of riders down to those that are most likely to best fit. That group of riders then ride together in preparation for the tour. So you're constantly tweaking around, everybody's preparing for it, and then you get to a point ultimately where you select the best. So lots of people will be preparing for it. It will be like having a depth chart. You'll have a couple of options for a super domestique climber, say, if I call it mid-mountain riders. You may have a couple of riders that'd be great on the flat and be early mountain riders. You'll have a couple of other riders who will be your high mountain support around your GC. And ultimately it's like your depth chart says all of them will be on a particular pathway to the tour. It'll be about how well they prepare and how well the teams gel.
And how many end up cycling at the event? So you mentioned a bank of 30. Do all of them go to the event?
No, so some may not be suitable for the tour. You've got a group of those that will be relevant, but there'll be a different competition journey towards the tour, and everybody will be on a slightly different competition journey. But say 5 or 6 riders who may end up riding in the Tour de France may ride together at a number of events. So you're also looking at how they gel on that journey, and that's made by that decision's made by the senior management team. So there are a group of riders that will fit the tour, there are a group of riders that won't. The group of riders that are fit for the tour will be, sort of mix and matching. It's a bit like selecting your A team and a B team. And then you're mixing them up for different races, and you're just seeing how everybody's coming together form-wise until you get really close where you select your team based on the gelling, their form, their fitness, the demands of that event and so on. So that's how it comes together.
And how many do you pick that go to the tour?
8 now. There's 8 riders, yeah. But you may have a short list of 12 to 14. And all that planning is done the moment the tour's announced in October. They'll already be shortlisting who's likely to be up for positions.
Okay. And what's the time period that you've got from knowing where the tour is to, well, you're cycling, you're racing? How much time have you got?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3. So it'll be 8 months, really. There's so many unpredictable things in that 8 months. But during that 8 months, one of the lead coaches who will manage the tour would have been scouting some of the stages. We'll be getting a good feel of it. Some of the core GC riders may have gone out and ridden it. A lot is dependent on weather. So there'll be a lot of familiarisation around stages which are believed to be really important. So you'll have 21 stages, and there may be 5 or 6 stages which are deemed to be absolutely fundamental, or ones in which you're likely to get time on your opposition. And they will really familiarise themselves with that in as much detail as they can. And riders may go there in and around the race calendar.
Sorry, how many stages were they, did you say, that you would focus on?
It could be 5 or 6. It will depend a lot on the stage, but they'll certainly know which stages they're likely to win and lose time.
Yeah.
And of course, like that, the dynamic of that changes on race day. In this Grand Tour, one of the stages when there was crosswinds, it was a relatively flat stage. The team made a call to absolutely go for it. They disobeyed the orders of the main sports director in the car because they saw the opportunity, and they took a minute and a half on the opposition. So although there's a plan, sometimes circumstances in front of them meant they could react to them and made a call with their sport director. And in fact, in that situation, they disagreed with him. They went for the move, they put the hammer down, they split the peloton, and they ended up getting a minute and a half for Egan Bernal.
Okay, that's interesting. And then just staying on the kind of recruitment journey of it, so really interesting that point you're making around trying to focus on the sort of half a dozen stages out of, I think, the 21 that you're going to probably get the greatest return on your investment. Anything else in that category of sort of immersive experiences that you give your cyclists, particularly if they've not toured before?
No, I mean, often before you're even considered for a Grand Tour, you would have been on a development period where you would have been introduced to week-long races, and you would have done other Grand Tours that are not as important as the Tour de France.
Okay.
So the Vuelta a España, we got a young guy called Theo Gilgenhart who's now done that a couple of times. So there's a sort of, you're building experiences so people understand what 3 weeks of racing looks like. and you'll be given leadership roles on a week-long race. So your exposure to different scenarios